Every war movie you've ever watched has lied to you. The cameras are drawn to the clamor of tanks rolling across mud, the glint of a sniper's scope catching the morning sun, the rattle of a machine gun cutting through a battlefield's chaos. These are the images that fill our imagination, yet they were not the instruments that claimed the most lives in World War II. Instead, the deadliest weapon on the battlefield was almost laughably simple: a hollow steel tube, a flat base plate, and a set of folding legs. It made no noise, it left no telltale trace, and it arrived without warning, turning even the most fortified foxhole into a death trap. U.S. Army records indicate that mortar and artillery fire caused nearly 2/3 of all American combat deaths in Europe. Rifles, pistols, machine guns, all the weapons traditionally glorified, accounted for only 14 to 23%. The most unassuming instrument on the battlefield killed more soldiers than everything else combined, and no amount of training could make a man immune to it. To grasp why, one must step into the boots of the men who felt a mortar round explode above them. A veteran recalled a quiet morning in France, when he and his squad spotted a few chickens pecking in a farmyard just beyond the ridge. Hunger gnawed at them. They crept down the slope, hoping to snatch a bird. Before they had even closed the distance, the Germans across the river spotted the movement and began their silent, deadly calculus. Mortar shells fell with no warning. The men ran, hearts pounding, every muscle straining against instinct, but not a single chicken was caught. The veterans' words lingered long after the war. Give a skilled mortar operator 3 rounds, and if you stand still, he can put it down your throat. 3 rounds. That's all it takes. Not an airstrike. Not a battery of heavy guns. 1 man, 1 tube, 3 thermos-sized shells. That was the scale of the terror. What made mortars so uniquely effective was their invisibility in action. Against artillery, a soldier could hear the whistling descent and dive for cover. Against a rifle or machine gun, he could trace the direction and seek shelter accordingly. But a mortar appeared without sign, dropping death from above with cruel inevitability. A moment of silence could be fatal. Soldiers could not predict it, could not brace for it, could not escape it. The design had a surprisingly humble origin. Mortars existed in some form as early as 1915, but their modern incarnation came from a British civilian engineer working in a workshop rather than a munitions factory. He created a device of staggering simplicity, a smooth steel tube mounted on a base to absorb recoil, with a bipod to stabilize the angle. The firing pin was fixed at the bottom. Drop a shell in, and it launched. No rifling, no mechanical breach, no hydraulic system. It could be carried and assembled by 3 men in under a minute. Initially rejected by the military, it required the intervention of David Lloyd George, the Minister of Munitions, before adoption. Stokes, the engineer, would later be knighted, and his design became the ancestor of nearly every infantry mortar in the world. The need for such a weapon was painfully obvious on the Western Front in 1914. Millions of men dug into frozen earth, staring across hundreds of yards of no man's land. Artillery could flatten a trench if shells struck at the perfect angle, but most fell short or glanced off parapets and sandbags. Soldiers crouching at the bottom of ditches were often untouched. The geometry demanded a weapon that could drop vertically, and the Germans, having observed mortars in the Russo-Japanese War, understood this necessity. By 1908, they fielded the maneuver in heavy, medium, and light forms. The British, unprepared, scrambled to produce any effective counter. Their first 75 mortars were crude, dangerous, almost as likely to kill their crews as the enemy. Some units resorted to catapults, highlighting the urgency and improvisation demanded by modern warfare. Between the wars, the French engineer Edgar Brandt refined the shell into a streamlined, fin-stabilized form. Range, accuracy, and lethality improved drastically. Soviets copied the design, Americans purchased it, Japanese adapted it, and by 1939 nearly every major army had its own version of the simple English tube. The lethality of the mortar rested on 3 elements no other infantry weapon combined: vertical trajectory, firing speed, and silence. Rifles and machine guns fired horizontally, artillery at shallow angles. Mortars arched their shells almost straight into the sky before falling with merciless precision. Trenches and foxholes, designed to protect, became death boxes. Speed compounded the threat. An 81mm crew could launch 25 to 30 rounds per minute, while a standard field howitzer managed 3 or 4. Mortars rarely operated alone. Batteries of 4 could saturate a position so rapidly that multiple rounds landed before the first impact had even registered. And unlike artillery, which screamed through the air, mortars moved silently, climbing and falling nearly noiselessly. The first warning of an incoming shell was the explosion itself. This was the battlefield reality. Crews worked from concealed positions, often behind ridges or trees, guided by forward observers who corrected each round. The first might land short, the second off to the side. By the third, it struck the target directly. Soldiers could not locate the source, anticipate the next strike, or fight back effectively. In the dense Herkin Forest of the German-Belgian border in 1944, American infantry walked into mapped kill zones. Trees soared 100 feet overhead, tightly packed, providing no cover. Mortar shells detonated in the canopy, sending splinters and fragments down into the open tops of foxholes. The 22nd Infantry Regiment fought there for 18 days, advancing 6,000 yards and losing 2,678 men, 1 for every 2 yards gained. Beyond the physical toll, the psychological impact was devastating. Mortars inflicted fear as efficiently as shrapnel destroyed flesh. Combat fatigue, psychiatric collapse, and mental breakdowns claimed over 500,000 American soldiers during the war. 40% of medical discharges were psychiatric. 1 in 4 casualties was mental, not physical. Soldiers could endure bullets and artillery, but mortars delivered relentless, unpredictable terror. Despite this, armies expanded their use. Mortars were cheap, easy to produce, portable, and deadly. The Soviets built 230,000 in 1942 alone. Japanese infantry used small mortars to offset obsolete artillery. Germans captured Soviet mortars and replicated them in large numbers, producing the Granatwar for 42. Mortars became the backbone of infantry firepower across theaters, replacing traditional guns in many instances. The weapon's adaptability was remarkable. On Okinawa, April 13, 1945, Technical Sergeant Buford Anderson faced a column of 75 Japanese soldiers. His squad was downed. Alone, he fired his carbine at point-blank range, then picked up mortar shells, both enemy and American, and threw them as improvised grenades, arming each before release. By dawn, the Japanese had withdrawn. Anderson survived and received the Medal of Honor, his bravery emblematic of the deadly simplicity and efficiency of mortars. Mortars, a tube, a base, and legs, killed more soldiers than tanks, machine guns, and snipers combined. Not due to sophistication, but because they left the soldier defenseless. Every wall, trench, or foxhole could be breached. Their vertical, silent, rapid fire rendered traditional defensive tactics nearly meaningless. If this account reshaped your understanding of World War II, please hit like, share, and subscribe to WW2 Impact, ensuring you never miss another detailed historical exploration. What World War II weapon do you think was the most underestimated, deadly, overlooked, rarely discussed? Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. These stories must be remembered. Every war movie you've ever watched has lied to you. The cameras always chased the flashy tank, the sniper hidden in the shadows, the soldier on the machine gun. But the weapon that killed more infantry than all of them combined in World War II looked almost laughably simple, just a hollow metal tube, a flat base, and a pair of folding legs. U.S. Army reports show that mortar and artillery fire accounted for roughly 2/3 of all American combat deaths in Europe. Meanwhile, rifles, pistols, and machine guns, all the weapons we usually think of, killed far fewer, only about 14 to 23. The most basic tool on the battlefield was deadlier than everything else put together, and no training could save a soldier from it. To understand why, you need to imagine what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a mortar round. One veteran of the battles in France remembered a day when he and his squad spotted a few chickens on a farm near the front lines. They were hungry and ran down an open slope to catch one. But the Germans across the river spotted them instantly and began firing mortar shells. The men were sprinting faster than the chickens, and not a single bird was caught. The veteran summed it up bluntly. "Give a skilled mortar operator 3 rounds, and if you stay in one spot, he can kill you." 3 rounds. That's all it takes. Not a battery of heavy guns. Not a precise airstrike. One man, one simple tube, 3 shells the size of thermos flasks. And here's the terrifying part. With artillery, a soldier might hear it coming. With a rifle or machine gun, he could gauge direction. But a mortar? There was nothing, no sound, no warning, no way to predict where the next round would strike. A moment of silence could end in an instant explosion. The mortar had been on battlefields since 1915. But where did it originate? A British civilian engineer designed it in a matter of weeks. Initially rejected twice by the military, it was eventually adopted, and soon the entire world began copying it. Back in 1914, The Western Front had frozen. Millions of men dug into trenches across hundreds of yards of open ground. Artillery could devastate positions from miles away, but only if the shells struck at exactly the right angle. Most rounds didn't. They would hit the parapet or sandbags while the men crouching at the bottom remained untouched. The problem was simple geometry. To kill a man in a trench, you needed something that could fall straight down. The Germans realized this first. Observers from the Russo-Japanese War had seen mortars in action and brought the idea home. By 1908, they had created the maneuver, heavy, medium, and light versions, about 160 ready when the war broke out. The British had none. The first months were a scramble. In just 3 months, Britain managed to produce 75 mortars, many crude, dangerous improvisations, almost as likely to kill their own crew as the enemy. Some units resorted to catapults. Then, in January 1915, a civilian engineer named Wilfred Stokes unveiled a design that would redefine infantry combat forever. It was deceptively simple: a smooth metal tube, a base to absorb recoil, a bipod for stability, and a fixed firing pin. Drop a shell into the tube, it slides down, hits the pin, and launches. No complicated breech, no rifling, no recoil system. One soldier could carry the tube. Another carried the base. A third carried the legs. The whole thing was ready to fire in under a minute. The army rejected it. The shells did not fit existing ammunition stocks. It took the personal intervention of David Lloyd George, then Minister of Munitions, to force it into production. Stokes received the knighthood for his trouble, and his design became the ancestor of virtually every infantry mortar in the world. Between the wars, a French weapons designer named Edgar Brandt refined the concept. He replaced the crude cylindrical bomb with a streamlined, finest stabilized teardrop shell. Range and accuracy jumped. The Brandt mortar became the international standard. The Soviets copied it. The Americans bought it. The Japanese adapted it. By 1939, every major army on Earth was equipped with direct descendants of that same English tube on a French shell. Not one of them fully understood what they had built. The mortar killed so effectively because of 3 things no other infantry weapon could combine: trajectory, speed, and silence. A rifle fires flat. A machine gun fires flat. Even most artillery fires at a relatively shallow angle. A mortar does not. It launches its shell nearly straight up. The round climbs high into the air, arcs over, and comes down almost vertically. That changes everything. Any cover a soldier can hide behind only works against something coming from the side. A mortar round does not come from the side. It comes from directly above and against something falling out of the sky. The oldest rule of infantry, get behind cover, stops working. A trench becomes an open-topped box waiting to be filled with shrapnel. Now consider the speed. An 81mm mortar crew could fire 25 to 30 rounds per minute. A standard field howitzer managed 3 to 4. One mortar tube put out more rounds in 60 seconds than a heavy gun did in 10 minutes. And mortars never operated alone. A battery of 4 could saturate a position so fast that by the time the first round landed, a dozen more were already in the air. Allied operational researchers ran the numbers and concluded that a single medium mortar delivered the equivalent firepower of 3 machine guns, except a machine gun needed a line of sight. A mortar did not. And then there was the sound, or rather the absence of it. An artillery shell travels faster than the speed of sound. You hear the shriek and you have a second to react. A rifle bullet cracks past, and you instinctively know the direction. But a mortar round moves slowly. It climbs and falls in near silence. There is no whistle, no warning. The first indication that a mortar round is about to land is the explosion itself. For the men on the receiving end, it was not a weapon they could fight because they could not hear it, could not see it, and could not predict where the next one would fall. Here is what that meant in practice. A mortar crew sets up behind a hill. A forward observer watches the target. The first round lands 50 yards short. The observer corrects. The second round lands 20 yards left. One more adjustment. The third round lands among the men, and by the time it does, the crew is already dropping shells into the tube as fast as they can feed them. The target has no muzzle flash to locate, no sound to track, and nowhere to hide. What happens next, what soldiers actually tried to do to survive this, is where the story gets worse, because every defense they had was useless. And in one forest on the German border, that fact killed more Americans than almost any other single battle of the war. If you want to see how that played out, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because what happened in that forest still haunts the men who survived it. A foxhole was the infantryman's first instinct under fire. Dig in. Get below ground level. It worked against bullets. It worked against artillery most of the time because shells came in at an angle and the blast went sideways. But a mortar round came down from directly above. It dropped into the foxhole like a stone into a bucket. The one place a soldier was trained to go for safety became the one place that offered none. A wall worked against flat trajectory fire. A building offered cover from machine guns. Neither stopped a mortar round. The shell simply cleared the obstacle and detonated on the far side. Retreating did nothing either. Without a sound to indicate where the fire was coming from, a man running blindly was just as likely to run toward the next impact as away from it. Counter-battery fire. Shooting back at the mortar was nearly impossible. A mortar crew operated behind a ridge, behind a wall, behind anything solid enough to block line of sight. The tube weighed under 100 pounds. Fire 20 rounds, pick it up, move 50 yards, set it down again. By the time the enemy zeroed in on the position, the crew was already gone. But the worst place to be under mortar fire was a forest. And in the autumn of 1944, the United States Army walked into one. The Herkin Forest sat on the German-Belgian border. 50 square miles of dense fir trees, some 100 foot tall, packed so tightly that a man could barely walk between them. The Germans had been there for months. Every section of the forest was pre-registered, numbered, measured, and mapped for their mortar and artillery crews. The moment American soldiers entered, the coordinates were called in. Shells began falling into the treetops. Here is what a tree burst does. The round strikes a branch or a trunk 60 feet above the ground and detonates in the canopy. The blast sends fragments and splintered timber straight down. A foxhole, which is open on top, becomes a collection point for falling shrapnel. Men who dug in died. Men who stayed above ground died. There was no correct response. The 22nd Infantry Regiment attacked through the Herkin for 18 continuous days. They advanced 6,000 yards. They lost 2,678 men. 1 soldier for every 2 yards gained. 86 of the regiment's strength. Company Baker went into one attack with 79 men. 54 did not come back. Ernest Hemingway, who was there, called it Passendale with tree bursts. The physical damage was only half of what the mortar did to infantry. The other half was invisible, and it destroyed more soldiers than shrapnel ever could. On September 15, 1944, Private Eugene Sledge landed on Pila with the 1st Marine Division. He was 21 years old. As the Marines moved off the beach and started inland, the Japanese opened up with heavy mortar fire. The men hit the ground. There was no cover. The shells fell faster and faster until they sounded like one continuous roar. Sledge lay in a shallow depression and waited to die. 35 years later, he still remembered every second. I thought it would never stop. One was bound to fall directly into my hole. I was out there on the battlefield all by myself, utterly forlorn and helpless. He was not wounded that day, not physically, but something in him changed in those minutes, and it never fully changed back. That was the mortar's second weapon. Not shrapnel. Fear. The kind of fear that accumulates, that does not go away between barges, that builds over days and weeks until a man simply stops functioning. The military called it combat fatigue. The numbers behind it were staggering. The mortar's shadow stretched far beyond its physical damage, reaching into the minds of every soldier unlucky enough to face it. A foxhole offered no solace. Trenches became death traps, their walls incapable of shielding men from shells descending like invisible hammers from above. Even the trees of a forest, dense and towering, could not protect those beneath them. Each shell that tore through wood and soil sent a rain of splinters down, scattering men like rag dolls and embedding a lasting fear that never faded. It was not the loud roar or the visible flash that haunted men, but the silence, the terrifying void before impact, when the world seemed to pause, and then, without warning, it exploded into chaos. Every movement, every heartbeat, every breath was measured against the unseen trajectory of a weapon that would not announce itself until it struck. Psychologically, mortars were unparalleled. The mental strain of living under their unpredictable fire was invisible, but its toll was staggering. American medical reports estimate over 500,000 soldiers were lost to psychiatric collapse during the war, a number equivalent to 50 infantry divisions removed from the battlefield without a single bullet fired. 40% of all medical discharges were for mental breakdowns, and in 1 of every 4 cases, men were rendered ineffective not by wounds but by the stress of enduring relentless, silent bombardment. Combat fatigue, shell shock, and despair became as lethal as the physical shrapnel raining down. Mortars imposed a cruel arithmetic. The longer a soldier endured their invisible fury, the closer he came to breaking entirely. There was no courage that could shield him, no training that could save him. Silence and randomness were the mortar's true weapons. Even in the chaos, ingenuity sometimes triumphed. On Okinawa, Technical Sergeant Buford Anderson faced the nightmare of advancing enemy soldiers while wounded, outnumbered, and nearly alone. He turned the very ammunition designed to kill him into a weapon of survival. Carbine fire, improvised grenades fashioned from unexploded shells, and rapid improvisation allowed him to hold his ground. By dawn, the enemy had been repelled, and Anderson survived to later receive the Medal of Honor. His story illustrates the paradox of the mortar: simple, cheap, and replicable, yet capable of creating scenes of both horror and extraordinary heroism. Armies understood this weapon's value and its efficiency. Tanks required factories, precise engineering, and months of assembly. Heavy artillery demanded specialized barrels, ammunition, and trained crews. The mortar required none of this. Any metal shop could produce it, any 3 men could transport it, and it could unleash a volume of fire unmatched by rifles or machine guns. By the final months of the war, every army had mortars deployed in overwhelming numbers. Soviet brigades flooded the Eastern Front, Japanese infantry supplemented obsolete artillery with light mortars, and Germans reverse-engineered captured Soviet designs to devastating effect. Across every front, the humble mortar dictated the rhythm of combat, turning even the best-trained soldiers into vulnerable targets. This unassuming metal tube, its base, and folding legs became one of the deadliest forces in World War II. It killed indiscriminately, destroyed morale, and forced armies to rethink the very notion of safety. Its victims ranged from fresh recruits to hardened veterans, and its legacy is felt not in heroic photographs of tanks or snipers, but in the silent, omnipresent terror that fell from above. Mortars proved that simplicity, precision, and the psychological edge could surpass even the most sophisticated weapons of war. If this story has shifted the way you see World War II, consider this your call to action. Hit like, share this video, and subscribe to WW2 Impact. Turn on the notification bell to ensure you never miss a story that uncovers the hidden truths of the battlefield, the weapons overlooked by history, and the soldiers whose courage endured the invisible storms. Comment below what the World War II weapon you think was most underestimated, one that was deadly, overlooked, and essential to understanding the war, and tell us where you're watching from. Every share helps these stories reach the people who deserve to remember, and every subscriber supports the preservation of history through the lens of WW2 Impact.